Beverly Hills was glowing in its usual golden splendor that evening. The air was crisp, tinged with jasmine and wealth, and the streets shimmered with the hum of luxury cars and the soft echoes of laughter from candlelit patios. Inside one of the neighborhood's most prestigious mansions, a sleek architectural marvel of glass and concrete, Alexander Reed stood silently by the window of his penthouse, a glass of bourbon in hand, surveying the skyline like it belonged to him. And, in many ways it did. Alexander had built an empire. A self-made millionaire, he was the face of modern real estate power in Los Angeles. His name opened doors, his signature closed billion-dollar deals, and his reputation for cold precision was unmatched. He had long convinced himself that emotions were liabilities, love a currency too volatile to invest in. Business was clean, clear, logical. People were not. Behind him, Sophie Monroe watched him with a mixture of love and weariness. Her fingers nervously twisted the edge of her silk dress as she stood by the fireplace. The dress had once made her feel beautiful. He had picked it for her 2 anniversaries ago, but now it felt like a costume, something borrowed from a life that didn't fit anymore. She had rehearsed the words 100 times, yet they still trembled on her tongue. She had tried to tell him before. There had been moments, quiet dinners, slow mornings, afternoons when his voice softened, but she had always hesitated, not because she was afraid of his anger. It was something deeper. The way he looked at her lately, like she was a guest overstaying her welcome, like she had already become irrelevant in a world moving too fast for feelings. But tonight was different. Tonight she had no choice. "I need to tell you something," she said softly. Alexander didn't turn around. His eyes remained fixed on the lights of Sunset Boulevard. "If it's about the Malibu property, I've already handled it." "It's not about work," she replied. He finally glanced at her, the flicker of irritation barely concealed. "Then, what is it?" She inhaled slowly, bracing herself. "I'm pregnant." The room fell into a silence so complete it seemed to absorb every sound in the city outside. The distant hum of traffic faded. Even the fire behind her seemed to quiet. Alexander blinked once, slowly. He placed the glass on the table with a deliberate calm. Then he faced her, his expression unreadable. "You're sure it's mine?" Her breath caught in her throat. "What?" "You heard me," he said, his tone as flat as a boardroom agenda. "You're sure it's mine?" "Yes," she said, stunned. "Of course it's yours. We've been married for 4 years. He stared at her, as if calculating, weighing, judging. "This is convenient," he muttered. "Just when things are strained." "Strained?" Sophie's voice cracked. "Alex, we've barely spoken in weeks. You come home after midnight and spend weekends with your phone. I've been here waiting, trying to hold us together." He stepped forward, towering. "And now you think a baby will fix that? Will anchor you to the life you're afraid of losing?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I thought you'd be happy." "You thought wrong," he said sharply. She backed away, holding her stomach protectively. "This isn't a tactic. This is our child." "I never wanted a child," Alexander said, ice in every word. "I made that clear from the beginning." "You never made anything clear," she shot back. "You charmed me, swept me off my feet, told me I was everything, until I wasn't." He didn't respond. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a checkbook. With swift practice movements, he scribbled a number and tore out the page. "Take this," he said. "It's more than enough to start over." Sophie stared at the check. Her name on paper, attached to a number so large it could erase most people's problems. But not hers. Not this. "You think I can be bought?" "I think you'd rather leave with security than pride," he said, placing the check on the counter. "I suggest you take it." Her voice cracked. "I loved you. And that," he said coldly, "was your first mistake." Sophie didn't shout. She didn't argue. She simply turned and walked to the bedroom. Her suitcase hadn't been touched in years, but her hands found it easily. She packed slowly, methodically, trying to keep her breathing steady. The life she had built here, the photos in the hallway, the holiday decorations she had stored in the closet, the soft music she used to play in the mornings, none of it mattered now. When she returned to the front door, Alexander was waiting, arms crossed. "You're not coming back," he said. She nodded once, numb. "I know." She stepped outside. The night air hit her hard, cool, biting, honest. She wrapped her arms around her stomach as the gate clicked shut behind her. The house loomed in the background, sterile and silent, no longer hers. And as she walked down Summit Drive, past the trimmed hedges and guarded mansions, she whispered, to the life growing inside her. It's just you and me now. But we're going to be okay. We have to be. She didn't look back, because she knew that no matter what came next, it would be hers to create, without permission, without apology. Just strength, just love, and a future waiting to bloom. The night Sophie Monroe was cast out of the home she once called hers, Los Angeles felt colder than it ever had. The glossy streets of Beverly Hills, usually radiant and loud with wealth, seemed eerily quiet beneath her trembling footsteps. Her suitcase rolled behind her with a stubborn clatter, each turn of its wheels echoing like a verdict down the pristine sidewalks. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to go. There was no one to call, no one she could trust. Her parents were long estranged, and her friends, the ones who once admired her glamorous life beside Alexander Reed, had all gradually vanished when their lives no longer aligned with the fantasy she had been trying to maintain. Sophie walked for what felt like hours, clutching her coat tightly around her and occasionally resting on bus stop benches to catch her breath. Her stomach, still barely showing, was already her top priority. Every step she took for the child she carried. She didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Eventually, she found herself on a street near downtown. The glamour of Beverly Hills was replaced by buzzing streetlights and the scent of grease from late-night taco trucks. She sat outside a closed convenience store, her body aching, her heart splintered, her eyes locked on a cracked sidewalk. A young man sweeping up nearby gave her a strange look, but he didn't speak. She was invisible now, reduced to nothing, more than a lost woman in an expensive coat that no longer held meaning. The next morning, Sophie found herself at Union Station. She hadn't slept. Her phone was nearly dead, her wallet nearly empty, and she still had no idea what to do. As she sat in the waiting area, surrounded by travelers rushing off to somewhere better, she remembered a name. Claire Monroe, her cousin. They hadn't spoken in over 5 years, not since Sophie had skipped Claire's wedding to attend a real estate gala with Alexander. Their relationship had faded with time and distance, but Claire had once been like a sister. She lived in San Francisco, that was something. That was hope. Sophie borrowed a charger from a station coffee vendor after buying a single banana and a bottle of water with her last few dollars. As her phone flickered to life, she scrolled through her contacts, heart pounding. Claire's number was still there. She hesitated, then texted. "It's Sophie. I'm in trouble. I don't know where else to go." There was no immediate reply. Sophie stared at the screen until the light went out again. Her hands trembled. Panic hovered at the edge of her consciousness, threatening to consume her. She was about to cry when a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "You okay, sweetheart?" Sophie looked up. A woman in her 60s, wearing layers of thrifted sweaters and a crocheted hat, stood beside her. She didn't look wealthy or polished, but her eyes were kind. I don't know," Sophie admitted. The woman sat down slowly. "It's okay not to know. What you do next is what matters." Sophie didn't know why, but she told the woman everything. Not the full story, not the private parts, but enough. That she was pregnant, alone, and broke. That she needed to get to San Francisco. The woman nodded as if she'd heard stories like this 100 times. Maybe she had. "Let me buy you a coffee," she said, "and we'll figure this out." At the diner across from the terminal, Sophie sipped warm coffee with shaking hands while the woman, who introduced herself as Dolores, tapped her purse gently. "I don't have much," she said, "but I know what it's like to be a woman starting over. Give me a minute." Dolores stood, walked to a few other diners in the restaurant, and came back with a handful of small bills. "I asked around," she said with a smile. "It's not everything, but you're almost there." Sophie stared, tears filling her eyes. "Why would you help me?" "Because someone once helped me. That's how it works." Just then, Sophie's phone buzzed. "Oh, message from Claire. Where are you? I'll cover your bus ticket. Come to San Francisco. You can stay with me." The tears spilled over this time. Dolores didn't ask questions. She just slid a napkin across the table and patted Sophie's hand. An hour later, Sophie was on a Greyhound bus heading north. She leaned her forehead against the window, watching Los Angeles fade behind her. She didn't sleep. Instead, she replayed everything. The look on Alexander's face, the sound of the check tearing from his book, the way he had made her feel smaller than ever. And then, slowly, those images gave way to softer thoughts. The woman in the diner, the kindness of strangers, the fact that someone was still willing to open their door. Claire met her at the San Francisco station just past midnight. She looked different, older, more grounded, but her hug felt like home. "You look like hell," Claire said softly. "I feel worse," Sophie admitted. Claire pulled back to look at her. "Then let's fix that." Claire's apartment in No Valley was small but warm. It smelled like lavender and tea, filled with mismatched furniture and the sound of a lazy cat purring in the corner. Sophie sank into the couch like she hadn't exhaled in days. She didn't talk much that first night. She didn't need to. Claire handed her a blanket, poured her a glass of water, and sat nearby, just keeping her company. In the quiet of that room, for the first time since she'd left Alexander's house, Sophie felt something she had forgotten. Safe. And even though her heart still carried the scars of betrayal, even though the road ahead was uncertain and long, Sophie realized she had already taken the hardest step. She had walked away from a life that no longer served her. She had chosen herself and her child. Whatever came next, she would meet it head on. Because starting over wasn't just survival, it was the beginning of something entirely her own. The days in San Francisco rolled in with a gentler rhythm than the glittering chaos of Los Angeles. Sophie Monroe had landed in a new world. One quieter, humbler, but no less complex. Claire's apartment became her safe harbor, not just a physical shelter, but a sanctuary for her unraveling spirit. It wasn't just the floral-scented blankets, or the warm cups of tea Claire brewed every morning. It was the way Claire looked at her, not with pity, but with a calm, steadfast belief that Sophie would find her way back to herself. Healing, however, didn't arrive like a tidal wave. It came in fragments. In the mornings when Sophie woke up and didn't immediately feel the heaviness of shame. In the afternoons when she allowed herself to smile at the sight of a child playing on the street below. In the evenings when she could sit beside Claire in silence and feel like silence itself didn't mean failure. Claire, with her steady presence and social worker instincts, gently nudged Sophie toward rebuilding. "You need more than just rest," she said one afternoon over soup. "You need a life, a routine, a reason." Sophie didn't resist. Deep down, she knew that motherhood wouldn't wait for her to fully process her trauma. The life inside her was growing, and with every flutter, every tiny shift, Sophie began to sense that she wasn't alone, not anymore. Her baby was already speaking to her in ways that weren't words, in hope, in presence. She started small. Claire introduced her to a friend who ran a flower shop in the inner Sunset neighborhood. The woman, Eleanor, was in her 70s and sharp-eyed, with weathered hands and a no-nonsense demeanor. But she hired Sophie without hesitation. "You know how to handle delicate things," Eleanor had said after their first meeting. "That's what flowers are. Delicate. But they bloom again and again, no matter how many times life cuts them down." The job wasn't glamorous, but Sophie found unexpected peace in arranging tulips, trimming stems, and learning the quiet language of plants. Each day, as she swept the floors or tied satin ribbons around bouquets, she was rebuilding parts of herself, parts that had been left raw and wounded in the cold aftermath of Alexander's rejection. Outside work, she began taking free night classes at the local community center. Graphic design, art therapy, creative journaling. Subjects that didn't promise immediate stability, but filled her with a spark she hadn't felt in years. Her old self, the version who once sketched flowers in the margins of her notebooks in high school, who had a dream of becoming an artist before she fell into the orbit of Alexander Reed's high-powered life, began to resurface. At night, she filled the journal with words she didn't speak aloud. She wrote to her baby. She wrote to herself. She wrote poems and promises and things she would one day tell her child about courage, about walking away, about finding the strength to begin again even when the world tried to convince you that you had failed. It was during one of those nights, sitting by the window with a cup of chamomile tea and her journal open on her lap, that she felt it for the first time. The softest flutter, like butterfly wings brushing against the inside of her skin. She froze, hand on her belly, eyes wide with wonder. A kick. A sign. "You're really in there," she whispered. "You're real." That moment marked a shift. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about preparing, about giving her child a future built not on luxury and status, but on love and truth. Claire noticed the change too. "You're not just healing," she said one morning as Sophie helped fold laundry. "You're blooming." Eleanor began letting her create small cards to go with flower orders. Sophie started designing them late into the night. Hand-painted. Illustrations with quotes that spoke to grief and strength and starting over. Customers began asking for more. One woman ordered 10 at once. Another left a note saying the card Sophie made was exactly what she needed to hear. With Claire's help, Sophie began selling the cards to nearby shops. She named the collection Bloom Notes, a quiet tribute to the transformation she was living through. The money was modest, but it meant something profound. Sophie was creating again. From pain, yes, from survival, but also from joy, from hope. As her pregnancy progressed, so did her confidence. She walked with more certainty. She spoke more freely. She even laughed, deep, real laughter, on nights when Claire played old jazz records or when a neighbor's dog tried to steal her sandwich. But there were still hard days. There were still nights when Sophie woke up in cold sweats, remembering Alexander's voice, his indifference, the way he had sliced her dignity apart without so much as a raised tone. There were still moments when she caught her reflection and saw not herself, but a version of her he had diminished. Those days she wrote more, sat longer in the flower shop, let her hands be busy until her mind found peace again. As the due date approached, Sophie enrolled in a parenting class at the community center. She learned about contractions and feeding techniques, but also about something far more important: resilience. She met other women, some young, some older, who had been left, abandoned, or forgotten. And in their presence, she no longer felt like a victim. She felt like part of a quiet, powerful revolution. Women who chose to raise their children not in spite of being alone, but as a declaration of worth. On a rainy Tuesday in May, Eleanor closed the shop early. "Go home," she told Sophie, handing her a wrapped bouquet. "You've earned a night off." Sophie took the flowers home, placed them in a glass vase, and sat beside them for a long time. She didn't need a mansion. She didn't need a man. She had a cousin who had become her anchor, a small apartment filled with laughter, a tiny business blooming from her heart, and a child, already her reason, already her hope. And even though her story had been written in pain, she knew she was holding the pen now. She would write the rest. Differently, Ethan Monroe was born on a quiet, overcast morning at Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital. There was no dramatic music, no flash of cameras, no father pacing the hallway. Just the steady rhythm of Sophie's breathing, the focused encouragement of nurses, and the overwhelming silence of a new beginning. When the nurse placed Ethan on her chest, Sophie felt the deepest ache of joy she had ever known. His skin was soft, his cry was strong, and his eyes, when they fluttered open for the first time, were an unmistakable shade of blue. She held him with reverence, as if breaking. Contact would wake her from a dream. But this was no fantasy. This was real. This was her son. The early days were a test of every fiber in Sophie's being. Sleep was a luxury she could no longer afford, and there were moments when Ethan wouldn't stop crying, when the bills on the counter mocked her, that she felt as if she were walking across a tightrope held together only by her will. But each time she looked at her baby, the strength returned. Sometimes it came in waves. Sometimes it barely flickered. But it always came. Claire continued to be her lifeline, stepping in as a second pair of arms, a gentle voice, and a soft place to land. She fed Sophie when she forgot to eat. She rocked Ethan to sleep when Sophie's hands were trembling with exhaustion. Together, they created a rhythm, a tiny orbit of survival wrapped in warmth and love. Sophie returned to Eleanor's flower shop part-time after a few months, bringing Ethan in a makeshift bassinet that sat safely in the back room. Eleanor, once gruff and matter-of-fact, softened in the presence of the baby. She would occasionally walk around with Ethan pressed to her chest, humming old jazz tunes while Sophie arranged peonies and crafted new designs for bloom notes. Those early years were fragile and golden. Sophie marked time not in holidays or vacations, but in milestones. Ethan's first tooth, his first laugh, the day he clung to her leg and called her mama, with a certainty that broke her heart wide open. Her world became small in the best way. She didn't care about red carpets or five-star restaurants anymore. She found meaning in grocery store runs, sidewalk chalk drawings, and Saturday mornings spent reading picture books with Ethan curled into her side. Her business grew slowly but steadily. She expanded her greeting card line into a full line of stationery, then partnered with a few local artists to feature hand-lettered quotes and watercolor imagery inspired by her own journey. Stores in Oakland and Berkeley began to carry Bloom notes. She started getting emails from women who thanked her for her words. Words they said that felt like someone had finally seen them. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the weight of it all returned like a tidal wave. When she saw a father tossing his child in the air at the park, or when Ethan asked innocently why he didn't have a daddy, Sophie had to pause and breathe before answering. He loved you in a way he didn't know how to show, she would say gently. But you have me. And that's enough, isn't it? Ethan always nodded, and in time he stopped asking. By the time he turned 5, Ethan was everything Sophie had hoped he'd be. Bright, curious, empathetic. He had her dark hair and quiet resolve, but his mind moved fast and his ideas were big. He loved puzzles, building blocks, and taking apart old appliances Claire no longer used. He asked questions constantly, some amusing, others profound. Why? Did the moon follow them home? Why didn't some people have houses? Why do people stop loving each other? Sophie never lied to him. She believed in truth, softened by compassion. You were born into love, she told him once, holding his small hand in hers, even if some of it couldn't stay. When Ethan started school, Sophie cried behind the wheel of her car after, dropping him off. Not because she was worried, but because it marked the beginning of a new era. One where her son would start to step away from her, one tiny stride at a time. And yet she welcomed it. Because she hadn't just survived motherhood, she had thrived in it. She enrolled in an evening course in digital marketing to help with her business. Claire insisted on babysitting, saying it was good for Ethan to know he was part of a larger village. Sophie graduated from the program with high marks and used what she learned to build an online store for Bloom Notes. Orders began arriving from across the country. One week, a hospital in New York ordered a bulk of her Hope After Loss cards for their grief counseling center. It was never about becoming rich. It was about becoming whole. Every step forward was a way of reclaiming the narrative that had once tried to define her. Ethan grew up knowing that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered in the corner of a small flower shop, folded laundry with tired hands, or showed up in the form of a homemade sandwich in his lunchbox, carefully cut into shapes because his mom never forgot how much he loved stars. When he turned 10, Sophie surprised him with a robotics kit she'd saved up for over several months. His joy was infectious. He tore through the manual like it was a treasure map and built his first working circuit in a week. His teacher, impressed by his aptitude, encouraged Sophie to enroll him in a STEM mentorship program. She did. He excelled. By the time Ethan turned 13, Sophie had framed his awards in their modest 2-bedroom apartment. The certificates sat beside handprints from his kindergarten art project and sketches she had drawn during pregnancy. There, home was a gallery of memories, not curated for anyone else's approval, just for them. And though the shadow of Alexander Reed lingered in Ethan's eye color and the sharpness of his profile, Sophie rarely thought of him. The man who had once threatened to erase her had faded into the background. She didn't speak of him unless Ethan asked. When he did, she gave honest answers, careful not to burden him with bitterness. Some nights, after Ethan had gone to bed, Sophie would sit at her desk and look out the window at the city. She would trace her fingers over her journal, now filled with years of lessons, love, and letters to herself. She had once thought being left was the end of her story. She was wrong. It was only the beginning. And everything after that had been hers to build. Stanford's sandstone buildings gleamed under the soft afternoon sun as Ethan Monroe stepped onto campus for the first time. His acceptance letter had arrived wrapped in crimson pride, and though Sophie had known for months this day would come, watching him disappear into a crowd of freshmen stirred something deep within her. Pride, yes, but also the echo of every sacrifice that had led to this moment. She stood by the car a little longer than necessary, watching her son move confidently into his new life, his frame carrying not just his backpack but the quiet legacy of her love and struggle. Ethan adapted, quickly. He had always been brilliant, but now he was among peers who challenged him, who sparked ideas that kept him awake at night. He joined the university's innovation lab, took extra credits in robotics and cognitive computing, and lost himself in midnight brainstorms fueled by ramen and relentless ambition. Yet even as he thrived, there were questions that began to surface, quiet, persistent whispers that had followed him since childhood. Where did his sharp mind come from? Why did his blue eyes, so unlike his mother's, draw second glances from strangers? Sophie had never hidden the truth from Ethan. She told him enough, that his father had left, that they had been on their own from the beginning, but she had protected him from the worst parts. She had never spoken Alexander Reed's name. Not because she feared it, but because she had rewritten her life so thoroughly that there had never seemed a reason to look back, until Ethan decided he needed to. It began with a name: Reed Enterprises. He had seen it in a financial news article about urban housing innovations in Los Angeles. The company's founder was mentioned briefly, accompanied by a headshot: salt and pepper hair, a sharp suit, piercing eyes that mirrored Ethan's own. The connection was undeniable. He tried to ignore it at first, buried himself in work, buried the sudden urge clawing at the edges of his mind. But the truth has a way of growing louder when silenced. One weekend, without telling anyone, Ethan booked a trip to Los Angeles. He said he was visiting a friend, but in truth he stood outside a tall glass tower downtown, watching his father's name stretch across the building like a monument to everything that had once broken his mother. Inside, he introduced himself at the front desk. "I need to see Alexander Reed." "It's personal," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Ethan said. "But I think I'm his son." There was a long pause, a murmur of confusion behind the counter, a phone call made in hushed tones. Then, "Mr. Reed will see you." He was led through corridors of glass and steel, through a space that felt more like a luxury museum than a workplace. When the office door opened, Ethan found himself face to face with a man who looked like a version of himself in 25 years. Alexander sat behind a desk large enough to command attention without a word. He didn't look surprised, just wary. "Your name?" Alexander asked. "Ethan Monroe." Alexander leaned back. The name lingered in the air. "And your mother?" "Sophie Monroe." Alexander blinked. A flicker of recognition passed across his face before disappearing beneath a mask of composure. "I see." There was no outburst, no apology, no dramatic declaration. Only a tension that thickened the room like fog. Ethan spoke first. "I'm not here for money, or a name. I just needed to see you." Alexander nodded slowly. "I never expected this day to come." "You should have," Ethan said quietly. "You left something behind." There was silence. Then Alexander stood, walking to the window. "I made decisions I thought were necessary," he said. "But I knew even then I would have to live with them." Ethan searched his face for regret, but all he saw was weariness. "I don't want anything from you," he repeated. "I just wanted to look at the man who walked away and understand why." Alexander turned. For the first time his voice cracked. "Because I was a coward. Because I thought I could control the damage by cutting ties before they tangled." Ethan nodded as if expecting nothing more. He stood to leave. "Does your mother know you're here?" Alexander asked almost as an afterthought. "No," Ethan said, "but she doesn't need to. She's the one who stayed." That night, Ethan returned to his dorm, the weight of the encounter pressing into his shoulders. He called his mother. From his room, the lights dimmed, his voice subdued. "I saw him," he said when Sophie answered. There was silence, a breath. Then, "I thought you might one day. I had to." "I understand." "He wasn't cruel," Ethan said, "just empty." Sophie's voice was soft. "That's who he's always been." "You never hated him?" he asked. "I tried," she said honestly. "But hate takes too much. I needed everything I had to love you instead." Ethan closed his eyes. He looked at me like he saw something he forgot how to want. "You're not his mirror," she said. "You're your own man, and you're nothing like him." And she meant it. The next week, a letter arrived for Sophie. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded at points. It was from Alexander. He had written to say he met Ethan, that seeing him stirred something long buried, that he had nothing to offer but the truth, that he had been wrong, that he had turned away from the only thing that ever might have softened him, and that he didn't expect forgiveness. Sophie read it once, folded it carefully, then tucked it away in a drawer, not as a keepsake, but as proof that the past no longer held power over her. Because what Alexander had abandoned had not withered. It had grown, flourished, and it had come back not seeking vengeance, but clarity. Ethan had faced the ghost of their story and walked away whole, and for Sophie, that was enough. The email arrived just after midnight. Ethan had been reviewing a set of reports for his startup when the notification lit up his screen. It was from an unfamiliar sender, but the subject line stopped his breath short. "Alexander Reed, confidential medical update." His pulse quickened as he clicked it open, a strange sense of foreboding crawling into his chest. The contents were brief but clear. Alexander was dying. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Months left, at most. For several minutes, Ethan sat in stillness. Though he had no reason to feel anything beyond vague discomfort, the news felt heavier than he'd expected. He thought of the man in the glass office, the conversation heavy with decades of silence. He had walked away feeling certain he needed nothing from Alexander. But death, even when it belongs to a stranger with familiar eyes, had a way of dragging things to the surface. He didn't call Sophie right away. Instead, he stared out the window of his Brooklyn apartment, the city humming below like it always did. He knew he had to tell her, and he knew she would understand before he even said a word. When he finally called the next morning, Sophie answered, with a soft "Ethan" that immediately settled his nerves. He told her what the email said, how Reed's legal team had forwarded the letter Alexander had written for him. It was apologetic in tone, hesitant, stripped of the businessman's polish. A man trying to make peace with the fact that the legacy he built with concrete and capital might crumble faster than the family he had walked away from. "He wants to see us," Ethan said after a long pause. Sophie was silent for a long time. "Do you want to go?" she asked. "I think I need to. Then I'll come with you." They met in Los Angeles 2 days later. The hospital wasn't far from the very tower Ethan had visited months earlier. But this time, there were no tinted windows or conference rooms. Just white walls, a slow IV drip, and the faint smell of disinfectant. Alexander Reed looked small now. His body was thinner, his hair grayer, his voice nearly a whisper when he spoke. He looked at Sophie first. It had been more than 2 decades, but time hadn't erased her presence. Her eyes were the same, though lined with the quiet resilience of someone who had carried more than her share of sorrow and still refused to bend under it. "I didn't think you'd come," Alexander rasped. "You asked," Sophie replied. He turned to Ethan then, and for a moment, the strength left his expression. "You're even more than I imagined," he said. "And I imagined a lot." The conversation that followed was not dramatic. There were no grand confessions or emotionally charged apologies. Instead, there was honesty. Simple, painful, long overdue. Alexander admitted his fear, his selfishness, how he had tried to rationalize his decision by convincing himself that Sophie and the child would be better off. But deep down, he had always known that wasn't true. "I've watched your name rise," he told Ethan. "You didn't need me, but I needed to know who you became." Ethan's voice was calm. "You'll never know all of it, but I came here because I wanted you to see that I'm not your absence. I'm everything she built." Alexander nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting with humility. "You're the best part of me, even if I never earned that right." Sophie sat quietly through it all, neither angry nor bitter. When Alexander turned to her again, he said, "I don't expect forgiveness." "I'm not here to forgive you," she replied. "I'm here to let go of what's behind us so I can keep building what's ahead." Alexander passed away 2 weeks later. In his final will, he left the entirety of his personal estate to Ethan. Not just the money and properties, but the journals he had written over the years, letters never sent, notes on life and regret. There were no conditions, no strings. Just a final attempt to offer something meaningful, even if too late. When Sophie was informed of the inheritance, she didn't protest. She looked at her son and said, "What you do with it is yours to decide. Just remember, it's not what defines you." Ethan donated a portion to fund housing and job training programs for single mothers in San Francisco. He named it the Bloom Foundation, a tribute to the cards his mother once sold from the back of a flower shop. The rest he used to expand his startup, now focused on developing digital mental health tools for young adults, especially those from underserved communities. When the press reached out about the inheritance and Ethan's lineage, he issued a single statement. "I carry no resentment, only gratitude for the journey that made me. My story is not about the man who left, but the woman who stayed and gave me everything." The year that followed was transformative. Sophie continued to live simply, still sketching designs, still volunteering at the community center where she had once taken her first night classes. Ethan visited often, always bringing new stories, new dreams. Sometimes they would walk through Golden Gate Park like they used to, and she would watch him talk with the same passion he had as a child when he'd explain how he was going to build robots that could help people feel less alone. At one of his major product launches, Ethan took the stage in front of a crowd of investors, journalists, and students. He spoke not of profits, but of people, of healing, of second chances. And in the front row, Sophie sat with her hands clasped, her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of awe. After the event, he found her backstage. "You saw all of it," he said, smiling. "I always did," she replied. They hugged, the kind that speaks across lifetimes. And in that moment, everything they had endured felt like part of a larger design. Messy, painful, but ultimately beautiful. Alexander Reed had left behind a world of glass and marble, a name etched in business journals and legal plaques. But his real legacy, the one that mattered, was not what he built but what he missed. Sophie had raised a boy with nothing but determination and love, and he had become a man who changed lives. That was the legacy that endured, one not of wealth but of grace. And it all began the night she walked away from a mansion in Beverly Hills and chose to become her own foundation. A few months after launching the Bloom Foundation, Ethan received an anonymous envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph. Aged, grainy, clearly taken from a distance. It showed Sophie pregnant and sitting on a bench in Union Station, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, looking lost and alone. Beneath the photo was a single sentence. "You don't know the whole story." Shaken, Ethan confronted his mother gently. Sophie's face turned pale. After a long silence, she confessed something she had never spoken aloud. On the night she left Alexander, she hadn't gone straight to San Francisco. She'd spent 2 nights in a shelter after being robbed of her last money. A man had offered to help only to try exploiting her vulnerability. She escaped barely. It was the darkest moment of her life, one she had buried so deeply it had never even made it into her journals. The revelation rocked Ethan, not because it changed how he saw his mother, but because it revealed just how much she had endured in silence. And from that pain, he created a new initiative within the foundation. Emergency shelters named Haven Corners, built specifically for women fleeing crisis. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us create more powerful, heartfelt content like this. Stay tuned for what happens next.